My name is Brittany, and I'm going to talk to you today about accessibility, everyone's favorite. So a little bit about me before we get started here. I am a front-end engineer at Formidable, and I'm a dev bootcamp grad with a BA in sociology and a background in a whole lot of other stuff that's not computer related. But I really like writing code that is easy to read. So what we're discussing. I've been building e-commerce and internal company apps for the last 4 years on different company teams. Over the course of that time, I've gotten to really see how accessibility is handled by various groups of people. Despite product, team size, and technology differences, I've found that accessibility issues are remarkably consistent across the board. So I'm here today to talk to you about how we can learn from these issues and make our work more inclusive from the get-go. Before we go any further, I just want to let you know that this is not the conference talk equivalent of Neo learning Kung Fu in less than a day in the Matrix, although if that would be possible, it would be amazing. And it's also not quick tips on bettering your accessibility skills or how to use a screen reader or guilting you into building accessible apps. My goal for this talk is that by the end of it, you feel like accessibility is approachable, and hopefully you'll start thinking about it more naturally throughout your workday. So let's briefly define accessibility. There's 4 types of disabilities that we need to design for: visual, auditory, motor, and cognitive. According to the CDC, these amount to roughly 26% of the US population. However, that's not accounting for temporary disabilities like broken arms or eye strain when we stare at our computers for too long. One other thing I'll mention here while we're getting going is you might hear people say A11Y or A11Y or ally in context of accessibility. These are all short for accessibility. My screen reader pronounces it as A11Y, and I'm unaware of the right way to speak it since its origin was typed as an abbreviation. And the reason this abbreviation exists is because there are 11 characters between the A and the Y in the word accessibility. So what's the problem? It's safe to say we all know building apps that everyone can use is important, and none of us are purposefully neglecting it. We've probably each said or know someone who has said, we'll save that for later. Personally, I've seen this happen on every single team I've ever been on in some shape or form, and I've been the person to say it on more than one occasion if I'm being honest. It seems to me that it's always the very first thing that gets scraped, and this can be for a variety of reasons. The way I see it, these reasons can boil down into a few core areas. One is time. There genuinely isn't enough time to do everything. Something has to get shelved. 2, designs. Maybe the ones we received are confusing, or we're told that the whole app is going to have some dramatic visual shift between now and our launch, so why bother with the extra effort? Or we just think accessibility-friendly apps are ugly, and we want ours to be really beautiful. The third reason I see is there's no need. We know our users are all able-bodied and using a mouse. There's literally no reason why they would be using a screen reader or a keyboard. And 4, the documentation is boring. I have tried to read the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG for short, and they are intimidating and they make me a little sleepy. We all know we should do better. Here's me guilting you after I said I wouldn't. And yes, the documentation can be really rough to get started on. Yes, HTML and CSS might not be your favorite part of your job. Maybe you think it doesn't even matter. And yeah, screen readers are intimidating. But I'm guessing that React was also intimidating when you first started. Or think back to the first time you were looking at JavaScript documentation. Also kind of overwhelming, right? You know what else is intimidating? Running a marathon. So I'm moderately athletic, and by that I mean I'm pretty confident I wouldn't be the first one eaten if we were being chased by a bear. Sometimes I like to sign up for a race to force myself to improve on my speed and my overall health. When I sign up for a race, I don't just sit around and hope that come race day I'll be super fast. I'm taking active steps to prepare myself, and by the time the race rolls around, I've more than likely already run 90% of the total distance and know what to expect. I think that this same sentiment applies directly to developing accessible apps. Essentially, we need to stop treating accessibility as something that we bust out in one sprint and start looking at it as a training program that we would follow like we would a marathon. If we do, we'll be way less fatigued and way better equipped. So how do we train? How do we start getting those accessibility muscles so that we can build inclusive apps and never dread another audit again? For the sake of time and simplicity, we're going to focus on 3 areas. First, we need to learn how to run. We'll go for walks and then jogs, and then we'll be capable of actually running. We'll maybe do some hills, some sprints, get our body used to it. And before long, we can actually run for a couple of hours and not want to die. We can apply the same thing to learning accessibility. If we break down the steps as we were learning to run, it might look a little like this, where we start out slow, but eventually gain speed. In order to have conversations about best accessibility practices, we need to first know how to walk. We need to understand the semantics that the browser gives us with HTML. Once we're walking with HTML structures, we can learn to jog with ARIA concepts. From there, we'll have a sturdy foundation and are capable of moving faster, exploring reference patterns, throwing in some fun stuff with navigation regions and focus traps. Doing all these things will give us the knowledge and empathy necessary to participate and improve on best practices effectively, aka running long distances. If we try to do this all at once, it's overwhelming, and we're back to writing to-do comments, not to mention getting a super shoddy race time, even if we cross the finish line. So today we're going to focus on the first 2 steps so that everybody can start running on their own. HTML semantics. There is a very strong likelihood that you're already using semantic HTML in your markup. It might just be a header element, but it totally still counts. Other common ways you're using it are when you use a label for an input tag in a form or a nav element for navigational purposes. It's just making your HTML tell a story for you as opposed to leaving your future self and coworkers guessing about what the purpose of each element is. So let's look at some examples. This example might seem a little contrived, and it completely is. However, it's really easy to overlook, and it's something I see pretty often when I'm reviewing code and looking at demos online. The thing to remember here is HTML is set up to handle nearly every single type of component when we break them down into more granular building blocks. Using them is going to make our code a whole lot easier for other devs on our team to navigate around. So again, looking at this example, when we use our semantic HTML building blocks, we can immediately know where we are in the code base. Whereas with the div soup on the left, we have no context about what is going on, and we're going to have to dig a lot deeper into it. With the one on the right, we can infer that our header describes introductory material, maybe a logo, some navigation. An aside is traditionally used for content that's in the body, but not the main point. Main tags indeed signify the main content of your view. And a footer is where we can store things like our copyright or maybe some site info. But as you can just start to see that using these elements, we're immediately understanding what's going on in this page. If we expand this example, we can see how this strategy pays off in the long game. By simply using what the browser gives us, we're giving ourselves a really solid foundation for accessibility. In the code to the right, you can see that my header has my main heading tag, my H1, which is my most important heading, and my aside contains a table of contents for my in-page navigation. Pretty much, before you use a div for a component, ask yourself what its core purpose is. Sometimes we won't be able to answer that question, and that's totally fine. The important part is asking, because if we can't answer it, it's an early sign we need to revisit our designs and find out more about what's going on. If everyone involved in creating our product can be on the same page as early as building an HTML outline, our scaling and feature building is going to have a much better foundation. Another part of semantic HTML we should touch on is using our heading structure how the good browser intended. Oftentimes, we select our heading tag, and by heading tag I mean H2, H3, so on, based on how they're set up by element in our style guide. When we do this, we're messing up our HTML outline, which is important because browsers use this structure to establish organic SEO content. On screen, you can see my demo app scrolling through content. To the left of the app is my heading structure, which I generated with an extension called Headings Map that I'll tell you more about later. But you can see in this example that I have a table of contents, heading level 2. This heading appears smaller than my other heading level 2s, but it's still nested under my main heading of building accessible components organically without skipping levels because I just wanted it to appear smaller. Now, if I were to give my table of contents a lesser heading tag, like an H4, because that's visually the size that I want, my outline would have my same heading 1, but then it would have 2 levels of undefined. So by the time we get to our table of contents, we have absolutely no idea what is the table of contents for. It could be for anything at that point. So when using headings, we should always consider the parent element and use the next heading available as it relates to that parent. This is the only relevant context for choosing a heading tag. We can always adjust our styling to be flexible to the element. Doing this will keep our code structured and allow our HTML to speak for itself outside of our current style guide. It'll make theming changes less rigid, and it'll help us when we use screen readers. Now that we've started looking at semantics, we must talk about buttons because this is an accessibility talk. There are a zillion resources online for this, so we're going to be brief. Mostly, I just want you to see that using elements that were given for our interactive components saves us a lot of unnecessary effort. So this first example is what not to do. As you can see in the screencast, I can't tab into that complete order button div. I can only click it. And what's a keyboard user to do? This is option 1 for fixing the keyboard issue. You can see that I'm having to track the keyboard separately from the mouse, and when I use a spacebar, the page is jumping all weird. You can also see some extra props I'm adding to the div to make the browser think it's a button. This is pretty much the minimum amount of effort you need to put in to get your div to be a button. It still isn't accounting for some of the state changes that buttons have naturally, like active, focused, or disabled, and simply put, divs were not meant to be interactive elements. So just do this. This button element was literally designed for this. The GIF to the right is me clicking the same button with a mouse, hitting enter, and using a spacebar on a keyboard. No more on key down needed, and no weird page movement. Lot less code too. So remember, buttons are for actions you take in your app. They cause something to happen, like submitting a form, finalizing a purchase, or agreeing to terms. If a designer or a PM wants you to have a button go somewhere within your app, that element is a link, not a button. And give your button text context that you can understand if you don't know what's surrounding it visually. If you can't actually display that text, use ARIA so that anyone using a screen reader doesn't just hear some ominous enter text being spoken. So now let's touch on forms. Forms are super important, we all know that, and building them correctly can sometimes be a hassle, but it totally pays off in the long run. First, let's see what not to do. This is what our form looks like, and remember, we're focused on structure here, not how beautiful my form is. And the code for that form looks like this. If you're not the author for this code, it's going to take you a little bit of time to figure out what's going on here. You'll see that I'm using state to track my values that are selected for my checkbox and my radio buttons because they're not properly built, and so HTML doesn't really know what to do with those. And I had to add a handler to monitor key down events, just like we just went through with our button example. So I'm not going to waste your time going into detail here about why this is wrong. I'm more interested in solving the problem and not pouring salt into some bad code wounds. I'll just say that chances are a lot of you have looked at some version of this and know that it's not that far off of code that we see in production. So now let's see the same form, only done with semantic HTML. Doing this the right way actually took less code, so I can fit it all into one screenshot, minus the last form closing tag. And when you look at it, I bet you know exactly what's happening. I don't need any state to manage my selected choices. I don't need any on key down events to monitor my inputs. It's way easier to see what belongs together. Making that second snippet a little bit bigger here, you'll notice that the use of field set and legend for this radio group. This clearly shows that these radio options are all part of the same group, and it gives them a title, that legend, to help group them. So I know that this form, and that's helpful for screen readers, but it's also helpful to us as developers because we know it gives us context. So I know that this form is a little basic, and you probably have something more visually complex to design for. My point here is to remember that the action getting taken is more important than what your mockup looks like. If your toggle component boils down to being a Boolean value, it's a radio input. And if your checkboxes have fancy animations, they're still checkboxes. Give them a good outline, and the rest is just styling. Now that we're on track with using our HTML elements accurately, let's talk about ARIA. ARIA gets a bad rep. First, we're told that we shouldn't use it, and then we're told we use it too much. I think it's just misunderstood, so let's go through a brief 101. I think the experts are right that we shouldn't be using it often. We really don't need it all that much if we write semantically. But sometimes we do need it, and when we do, the documentation can be a little rough. There's two types of ARIA we'll use, state and properties. Let's look at stateful ARIA first. Our first example of ARIA state is ARIA disabled. This works like we would use on our disabled prop on inputs, but it's handled more gracefully by screen readers. It's stateful because it's expected to change throughout the lifecycle of the view. We can use the accessibility tab in our dev tools to see what ARIA is attached to elements. Here we can see that ARIA disabled Boolean is changing as I interact with the button on the page. Using these built-in tools is a great sanity check for what's actually getting legibly parsed to your structures. And here we have our checkbox. By using ARIA checked on our screen reader can better understand what's going on with the value of that checkbox. You probably don't need this on every normal checkbox, but it will come in handy when you have to do something fancy, and that's what a lot of ARIA is for at this point. If we're writing code for something that we can't use semantic HTML for, that is when we use ARIA to fill in the blanks and get us interactive context for our feature. Now let's talk about properties. These are values we don't expect to change through the lifecycle of our view. The first example demonstrates the classic X to close scenario. There's absolutely nothing descriptive for a screen reader about saying X button. But we can use our described by ARIA property and tell the browser to use this hidden ID for a description of what the X actually is describing, in this case, closing something. So we can see this in action if you look at the description section on the right side of the screenshot. One more to drive it home, and this one's my favorite. So the UX team has come up with this friendly form for visual users that assumes some surrounding knowledge of where they are in the data entering process. Oh no! Cue ARIA labeled by. So here we have an input that needs to show an address or a label of address, but what does that mean? If we can see, we know that this section has text of billing associated with it. Otherwise, this is just some rando address. To fix this, we can use ARIA labeled by and reference that billing text to preface our input label. So we end up with the billing address announced to our screen reader, but the visual is kept tight. Both our design team and our users are happy. So those are the two types of ARIA. Remember, with great power comes great responsibility. Ask yourself when you use ARIA, why are you using it? Is it because you're doing something out of the box, or is it just because you're using divs? So from semantics and ARIA, we have a really solid foundation to spring from and learn more advanced accessibility topics. We can start looking at reference patterns for accessibility components. We can recognize and build for screen reader navigation regions, solve for focus traps with our modals without being overwhelmed, and help enforce best practices on our teams. As we go forward, we'll start to see an improvement in our work product and our teams. We'll have less interactive bugs reported to us from QA. We might have more user conversion because a wider pool of people can access our app. Our SEO will improve organically, and our CSS traps have improved by not cheating and using divs for everything. By building up our skills this way, getting to our best practices is way less exhausting to think about. So now we know how to run, but just knowing that bit isn't enough for our training plan to be successful. We still need to know how to make good nutritional habits and stretch. So let's move on to those areas. First, let's talk about better nutritional habits. For our marathon, this would mean drinking enough water, cutting out junk from our diet, getting those healthy fats and carbs to help fuel ourselves. We could, in theory, do all of these starting at once, but staggering might make our foundation stronger and we'll be more likely to stick with it. Our accessibility nutritional habits are our environments and tools we have to help us write sturdier code. And as with our dietary example, doing this incrementally will form habits we're less likely to abandon. There's about 1 billion tools that have been made to help our dev environments, and every time I mention what I use to other people, they tell me what they use, and now I have all those tools, and the list just keeps growing. So I recognize and am admitting that I'm skimming the surface here. But if there is one extension you add today, it should be this one. Axe by the team at Decay is amazing. It's extremely straightforward and helps you figure out what areas you need to improve your accessibility, and they even tell you how to fix it. Be it your code, colors, content. This extension makes accessibility truly understandable. And there's a free version and a pro version, so there's no excuses not to add it to your dev tools in Chrome and Firefox today. I already mentioned headings map and for heading outliners and heading outlines earlier, but it's worth revisiting for a second in fuller context. So using an HTML outliner extension can be a great sanity check for pages because it makes the headings easier to parse quickly and identify if there's an issue skipping parent hierarchy. Building views can be compared to building a strong speaking outline. For instance, if I didn't first mention that we're talking about extensions and jumped from my talk title, my H1, accessibility is a marathon, not a sprint, to immediately talking through headings map for HTML outlines, it'd be real confusing, and I should probably add some more structure to my talk. To look at a few examples. Wikipedia is a great resource for good outlines. If you want to dig deeper into this, look at anything on Wikipedia. A cursory look at this page, and you can see that their elemental usage doesn't rely on their styles at all. The outline is thorough but precise, and it reads like an A+ research paper, assuming, of course, that this teacher likes Fast and Furious. Here's a site for a brand I love. They do a pretty okay job with their headings, but you can see that they have some heading level 4s at the same level as 2. If you look at the page, you can see that it's because they're relying a little bit more on the heading level for their styles than Wikipedia was. I'm not bringing this up to shame the devs who did this. I just think it's a really great example of a pit that we all fall into. And this one surprised me a little bit. I was actually looking for good examples when I tried this site. This is a magazine that has a lot of culture value, and they're using divs for their headings. We don't see any of the headlines from this UI shown in our heading outline. This is because their headlines are actually divs, and you can see that I went and inspected their code and grabbed that. You can see how this heading facade can be detrimental to comprehending page purposes if you can't actually just see it. Proper heading structures are just an easy win, especially when your site is externally facing and you want people to find your articles when they Google "scientists discover stormquakes." By not using our headings properly, we're preventing search engines from scraping our heading maps and using it to generate user search results. Another type of extension for accessibility research are ones that modify the way the browser is seen by different types of visual impairments. These could be for color blindness, contrast checkers, or astigmatisms, just to name a few. This one's called No Coffee. In this little GIF, I am looking at the Grand Canyon website and increasing my blur on my vision. Now, if I were looking at this and I was making something on this website, I might think about using a thicker font. That way people with slightly blurry vision can also still see it. This one is another one for demoing visual impairments called See Like the Colorblind, and I think it's helpful for examining color contrast on site. Not only are tools like this helpful for testing, but they also help me, as an able-bodied dev who doesn't have to actually think about this naturally, have empathy, and it makes me a more considerate developer down the road. The last type of tool I'm going to touch on is something a little bit more pragmatic. Please lint and test your code. Add the A11Y JSX ESLint plugin to your linting setup so you can prevent early mistakes, and add automated testing that will check for accessibility errors. These two tools in your build are particularly invaluable, especially if you're inheriting some sort of inaccessible code base and fixing it is daunting. I heard this tip from a talk on accessibility that Jen Luker gave earlier this year, and I think it's worth mentioning here. When you add accessibility linting, turn everything to warn except one thing. Turn that one thing to fail, and then make it mandatory that ESLint pass to push up code for review. Your team will just fix everything organically. So we've got our running and our nutrition covered. Here's the part that a lot of new runners will forget. We need to make sure that the rest of our body is prepared to run a good distance by stretching. For our accessibility purposes, this comes in the form of learning to interact with the UI in ways that lets us understand the updates we're making to our code. We've probably all been testing for responsiveness and cross-browser functionality. Screen readers and keyboards should be added to that list. Your work needs to be responsive to these environments just the same as a tablet or an iPhone. Just like you wouldn't wait until after you finished your app to add responsive views, you shouldn't wait to test with a screen reader and a keyboard. If we do this on a component or a feature level, it's so much easier to swallow. Plus, we'll perpetuate fewer issues by catching them earlier and learning from them. So let's go back to that demo form code I was showing you earlier and see how we benefit from just using Semantic HTML. Let me get my cursor to my second screen, which was hard the first time, so here we go. Okay. So the sound is not working, but you can read the subtitles. And you can see here that this first form has no context for what those radio buttons are. It doesn't know what is going on with John Wick, Obi-Wan, or Xander. But whereas when we enter this good form, we're starting to see context for those labels. You can see the label actually being announced first. And as you go into it, you're just getting to know actually what you're interacting with instead of just thinking, well, I think this is the radio button for me. It's saying that it's in a group as opposed to just a radio button. So, sure, there's stuff in here that we can improve with further structuring, but I just want you to see how incredibly far you can get by just writing legible code. So now we're ready. We know our training routine, and we just have to stick with it. We're creating accessibility muscle memory and grasping terminology that will make us more inclusive from the get-go. As we train for our accessibility marathon, we're seeing some great side effects, like easy performance wins when we use Semantic HTML for things like picture to control image size, organic SEO improvements for our structured data since it's more parsable by machines. Our code is legible. The way our components are expected to function is standardized across our app. Our users are happier, our customer base is probably growing, our engineers are contributing to conversations with designers and PMs in a more meaningful way at earlier phases of development, and because of all of this, we're actually saving time, which was the whole reason we were stalling on implementing accessible apps in the first place. So I hope that this helps you look at accessibility from a new, fuller perspective, and that these concepts can help save you time, frustration, and rewrites. It's important for all of us to remember that accessibility isn't just a sprint, it's a marathon that we need to train for consistently so we can meet our deadlines head on. Thanks.